So you've looked at the papers then on animal welfare. The ones I picked cover a kind of a range of disciplines, if you like, around animal welfare, but there's a bit of a common theme in all of them: welfare. These are the areas where I think a lot of our perception around animals and a lot of our beliefs about how animals are treated are probably most vulnerable, or maybe the most misaligned with what actually happens. So in a lot of these papers, what they're pulling apart is actually how animals are now treated, what kind of things are scored, and what's looked for in terms of treating for those animals. The first paper then I'd want to kind of pull apart a bit is the one by Grandin, and this is the one where they're looking at the improvements that have been made in basically pork, sheep and beef slaughter plants. And you might think, oh no, please don't, but abattoirs, animal slaughter, it's part of their life process. These beautiful beasts behind me would love to be destined to be a lamb chop or a nice Sunday roast. But the way in which they are treated, the way in which they go from being either an outdoor grazed lamb or a raised in a shed, the way in which they are then finally slaughtered and put to rest is important. Avoiding stress in those periods and actually treating them with respect becomes really critical. And this paper by Grandin really goes into the detail of that, but from an animal perspective. It pulls itself apart and it fills it with figures and numbers. So if you're into numerical data, if you really like to look at the hard data and really crunch things and pull it apart, this paper by Grandin is full of that kind of information, and in that regard it is brilliant. The language that he uses I find very accessible, and I think it's generally a well-rounded, very good and engaging paper around what actually happens in abattoirs in various parts of the world today, and therefore how we maybe might change our perceptions about what happens to beasts just like this at the end of life. A useful paper, still though calling for change, still calling for improvement, and I think that's also something that comes through in some of the other work as well. In terms of conflict of interest, he works for the animal department out of a state, so probably some, but maybe not huge. The work I therefore feel is real. It has actual numbers that have been recorded in a way that I have belief in it. And I do actually find myself coming away from reading that paper and thinking, you know what? It's well written, I like what he said, and my opinion around maybe the way in which abattoirs process meat and indeed deal with animals as living beings, I think is therefore satisfied. I think the right kind of stuff is being done. So when it comes to cattle, one of the other areas we might look at then is that one around live exports and the systems. And we've got a couple of papers around that. But the first one actually is the one by Foster and Overall, and it's not so much a paper as a personal view. And that's probably why it's set out a little bit differently. And I wanted to give that to you because it tells a story from a slightly different perspective. It's not a scientific paper, it is actually a personal opinion. So already when you're reading it, if you haven't picked up on that, the fact it does say personal view near the top might give you an insight into the fact that maybe it's going to present things a little differently. The first thing you notice is there's no abstract. The paper is devoid of an abstract. There's nothing here that tells me quickly and easily what I'm going to find when I get into this. So as I start reading, what do I find? I find a lot of really emotive writing. It's very engaging, but it also tells a story that says to me really, you know what? Live exports, transportation by sea is something that we really shouldn't feel happy about, that a lot more needs to be done. And I come away just thinking that yes, there has been changes in the system, but there hasn't been enough. So if already I was thinking live exports was something that was horrendous from an animal welfare perspective, on the back of a paper like this, I would find my beliefs reaffirmed. There's limited methodology. It really is just an outpouring of feelings and of opinions, occasionally backed up with references. It's scant in that regard. And the final thing, I guess, to look at when we're looking at that, we talked about bias maybe elsewhere, but is why might there be a bias? Well, it turns out that the conflict of interest declared by both authors is that they're both members of the Vets Against Live Exports. So an interesting paper, a very emotive paper, and one that I think probably goes a long way to saying that there may be problems in the system. The other one I've given you here is a paper by Petherick. Now, this one is around about animal welfare issues, particularly in the Northern Territories or in the Northern Australian beef production systems. The distances involved up there, the breeds of cattle that we use up there, the whole fact that the system is very different. And this paper, albeit it feels rather thick, goes into a lovely, very readable amount of detail about all the aspects of production of livestock and particularly beef in those areas. It does, of course, also touch upon that area of live export and, of course, distance and transportation, because any livestock coming from up there for carcasses or even live animals to be moved, they have to generally travel large distances. It touches upon that, and it's less emotive in its writing. It's more looking at where we are now, what changes have happened in our welfare and in our approach to those systems since the 1970s and through into the 1990s, and even with more recent change. Is he happy? Is there more to do? And the answer is, I think, yes. And I think that's fairly clear as well. Whilst it says we have made great progress, whilst it says there is still a need for this system, it does say that changes, particularly around things like castration of young bulls and other areas where the animals have to maybe have surgical type operations or other things change, we need to think about those kind of things more, but we need to think about them within the context of that northern production system. It's very different. There's not pens, there's not feeding. The ranges that those animals are covering is huge, and that's largely why there's even a section on here about mustering with helicopters, the stresses that that causes and what that does to the animals. An interesting read, a very real read, and a very accessible read, which I think tells a very important and balanced story for the way in which we produce beef in those northern production systems. So that's one of the ways in which we're looking at beef, and I hope you've enjoyed those papers on animal welfare.